Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English A and room 303. We are on page 664 and following of your hymnal. We now turn to the final two readings of our Senior A volume number 1. We are actually looking now at writers who, while always are qualified as part of this neoclassical period, as we've used this term already, sitting alongside Swift and Pope. The truth of the matter is Thomas Gray and his life and his life's work is in many ways more of a romantic kind of offering, and we start the Romantics in Senior English B. Let's turn to page 664 really quickly and do a little bit of preliminary work here to help us prepare for this elegy written in a country churchyard text, all right, connecting to the essential question 664. Like each of these authors, you might sometimes seek out a special landscape or place where you want to think things over. Noting the qualities of each author's special place as you read will help as you consider the essential question, what is the relationship between literature and place? So let's jot it down really quickly. This poem, actually the two poems that we're going to study, we're going to look at Nocturnal Reverie as well. Both of these poems highly influenced by this notion of place. Let's look at literary analysis in 2B really quickly. 18th century pre-Romantic poetry shares characteristics of two different styles. Like earlier, neoclassical poetry, pre-Romantic poetry is characterized by these features, and I hope you have these written down, at least bullet pointed. 1, polished expression of ideas. 2, use of balanced phrases, sophisticated vocabulary. At the same time, pre-Romantic poetry anticipates Romantic literature by introducing these elements. 1, new focus on nature, the life of common folk, and 2, the expression of heightened, sometimes nameless feelings. Look for all these characteristics as you read the following poems. And then notice under the heading, comparing literary works on page 664. Like the Romantics who came after them, Gray and Finch express heightened feelings in their poetry. Gray's stroll through a country churchyard, a graveyard, lets him discover life's true value. Finch's nighttime walk allows her to feel a deep connection with nature. As you read, compare the emotions these poets experience and analyze 2 or more themes or central ideas in the poems. Consider how these themes develop and build on one another to produce a deeper meaning. Under reading strategy, notice that determining the essential message or main idea of a passage in a poem by paraphrasing it, identifying its key ideas and restating them in your own words is a good idea, using a chart like the one to your right there. You'll want to pay attention to these 6 vocab words on 664 as well. You'll know they're ending up on the exam, and of course they'll help us with the reading. The first thing we want to write down of Thomas Gray, make sure please that you've got the dates. 1716 to 1771. We are getting closer with the death of Gray to 1800 and what we will call the birth of English Romanticism. This is the author of Elegy written in a country churchyard. Let's go ahead and read on 665 really quickly. The uncertainty of life was something that Thomas Gray understood all too well. The only one of 12 Gray children to survive infancy. Look at that statistic. 12 children born and only one of them makes it to adulthood. He suffered from convulsions as a child. On at least one occasion, his mother was forced to open a vein to relieve the pressure on his brain, so he himself has bad health. Lavishing affection on her sickly son, Gray's mother saved money from the shop she kept in London and sent him to Eton, a famous school in England, and then on to Cambridge University. A quiet life. After making the grand tour of Europe with his friend, the author Horace Walpole, Gray lived with his mother and aunts in the sleepy village of Stoke Poges. There, in the summer of 1742, he wrote his first important poems. The church and graveyard at Stoke Poges probably inspired his best-known poem, Elegy written in a country churchyard, the one we're going to look at. A near mishap, another heading. This beloved poem nearly went astray. Gray sent a copy to Walpole, and it fell into the hands of a dishonest editor. It was retrieved only after a struggle. In the end, the poem came to belong to its readers. It contains some of the best remembered lines in English poetry. A lonely romantic, the last heading. After age 30, Gray returned to Cambridge, where he studied classical literature and Celtic and Norse mythology. Died after an attack of gout. His literary output was small. He wrote slowly, striving for perfection, but his poems are counted among the finest in the English language. In them, he expresses new, romantic yearnings in the formal style of his times. The poet Matthew Arnold later suggested that if Gray had lived in another era, his accomplishments might have been even greater. Let's turn now to this famous poem, Elegy written in a country churchyard. Well, begin with the background information on 667. Read it with me real quickly. In the 18th century, many writers championed reason, clarity, logic. These values led to the articulate, eloquent couplets of Alexander Pope. We've seen these already. They also led to the major scientific discoveries of Sir Isaac Newton, of whom Pope wrote, "God said, let Newton be, and there was light." These values might be thought of as belonging to daylight. In contrast, the poems in this grouping are set at twilight or at night. So let's write that down. Both of these poems set at nighttime, or in the evening, in the gloaming time. They stress emotion, the not always reasonable reaction to circumstances, and mystery, those longings and intuitions of human experience that are not clearly communicable or analyzable. By stressing these nighttime qualities, these poets anticipate the artistic movement called Romanticism. Now there's a couple of things we want to say really quickly before we read this poem, so it'll make some sense to you. In Europe, not unlike certain parts of especially New England, you will find that you have a church building, and then outside of the church building, you will, maybe you've seen this in a movie or something, you will see that there is a graveyard there, okay? That graveyard is sometimes referred to as a churchyard, all right? Number two, this poem only makes sense if you're able to understand the distinction between urban and rural. So let's write these two words down and make sure we understand them. Urban and rural. Now what do we mean by that? It's the difference between the city and the town. In other words, it begs this question. If you had grown up not in a small town of 3 stoplights and 5,000 people, but in a large city, would you be a different you? So we often ask seniors this question. If you, for example, had grown up in Denver, would you be a different you? Now notice how relative this whole discussion is, right? So we live in a town of 5,000, but when, for example, when we from our town visit, for example, a smaller town like Hyattville or Tinsley, we go, oh man, I can't imagine living in such a small place as that, right? Of course, people visiting from Casper will pass through Wohlen and say, what? Oh, I can't imagine living in such a small town. People who, of course, come from Denver through Casper go, can you imagine living in such a small town as this Casper place? And of course, people who live in Los Angeles visit Denver and go, it's a pretty small town. In other words, it's all kind of relative. But it does beg the question, are people different who live in small towns versus the big city? Are there different kind of values there? Do people think differently about what's important and what's not important? That kind of thing, okay? In this poem, we are going to have a poet who will sit in the evening outside of a churchyard, a graveyard. And he begins to think out loud about the rhythms of the life of these really poor people who live in this town, right? They, many of them, are now dead and buried in the very graveyard where he is sitting next to, okay? And he begins to kind of think about this. And then finally at the end of the poem, and you can kind of write this down to forecast it at level 1. At the end of the poem, he asks about himself. And he says, I wonder if I were to die and be buried in this graveyard, what would go on my tombstone? Now this is going to seem kind of like a really morbid question, but for Thomas Gray, this is a legitimate question. It's a 3B question. We'll come back to it. If somehow tragically you were to pass away today, your friends would get together, they would have a burial for you, they would put you in the ground or whatever, and then there would be this tombstone that would be set over your grave. What would the words on that tombstone be for you? 2 questions. 1, would you want to say what those words would be for yourself? In other words, you would write down, I want these words on my tombstone. Or would those words be resigned to somebody else in your life, an adult in your life, some friends of yours? And what would they say about you on your tombstone? This is a question for the end of our poem. Let's go ahead and jump to 2B really quickly. I'm with you looking on page, note the irony, we're on 666 to read a poem about death, go figure, right, in your hymnal. On 666, 667 now we'll start this project. Notice right away at 2B, do you see how this poem is divided up into 4-line stanzas? Let's write that down in 2B, 4-line stanzas. And notice that you will have a rhyme scheme where day rhymes with way, Lee rhymes with me. Do you see this? Sight rhymes with flight. Holds rhymes with folds. Right? Also, notice the rhythm. The curlew tolls the knell of parting day. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. So we've got that iambic pentameter thing going on, so let's write that down as well at 2B. So you'll notice right away, Thomas Gray is in command of the closed form here, no question. All right? But what we really want to do now at level 1, and I recommend that you do this in your notes at level 1, is simply number these stanzas. The examination will ask a number of questions, obviously, from this poem, and it'll help you if you kind of have a sense of what each one of these stanzas is saying. So we're just going to read a stanza, and then we're going to summarize it. Does that make sense? At level 1. So let's just do this work really quickly. We're going to read a stanza, we're going to summarize it. Let's begin. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day, the bell at the end of the day, in the church steeple. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The plowman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Let's write it down at level 1. Very simple. He says, end of the day, the guy who has been working with his cattle out in the fields now is bringing them back home, right? Every morning he will leave, he will take his cattle out into the field, and then in the evening he will bring them back. The world to darkness, meaning this evening time as the sun is going down. Now fades, second stanza, now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant falls. Very simple. Evening time. There are certain sounds of evening, right? And let's point out, for this poem and the poem to follow, the 5 senses are all going to be elicited. What you can hear, what you can see, what you can smell, etc., etc. And notice the light is fading, the glimmering landscape, right? Notice as well that you've got the drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Okay? Now, some students will ask, is Gray doing this intentionally? But look at lines 7 and 8. Look at them really quickly. Did you see that the last 2 words of line 7 is drowning flight? And the last 2 words of line 8 is distant foes. Both words begin with a D and an F. Do you see this? Now, some students will say, is this intentional by Gray? And let's just point out, this is his genius. So we'll continue to marvel at some of the amazing poetics here. Look at the 3rd stanza. Save, that means except, from yonder ivy-mantled tower, there's ivy growing on the bell tower of the church, the moping owl does to the moon complain, the owl is making some noise, of such as wandering near her secret bower, molest her ancient solitary reign. In other words, the owl is making sounds in the evening, right, as the sun is going down. Of course, owls are nocturnal and hunt at night. Let's look at the next stanza. Beneath those rugged elms, that is to say really old trees that are planted around the graveyard, that yew tree's shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. Now, for the first time, let's put it in our notes at level 1, for the first time, we are going to move from talking about the sun going down to all of a sudden recognizing he's sitting next to a graveyard, and notice it is the moldering heap, right? The mound of the people who have been buried. And then notice what he says about the graves. Let's write it in our notes at level 1. He calls it the narrow cell. Of all the bedrooms that you will stay in your life, wherever those are, you will never spend more time in any bedroom than you will in the grave where you are buried. Right? Kind of a, some would say kind of a morbid thought, and yet I suppose it's a realistic thought, right? Let's think about it in those terms. Right? Notice he says, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude, here rude means plain, uneducated. They're not big shots at all. Forefathers, the people who used to live in this town, of the hamlet, not town, right? Even it's smaller than a town, sleep. Notice he says that the dead sleep. So already, let's point out at level 2B, we have a certain kind of tone in this poem. What would you qualify this tone as? We would say maybe it is a tone that is somber, sad, melancholy, reflective, we might say, nostalgic even. Now we'll continue on 668. The breezy call of incense breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed. Let's just point out what he says here at level 1. He says there are certain things they're never going to hear again. These guys buried in the ground, they're never going to hear the morning and the smell of the morning. They're never going to hear the bird, the swallow, twittering, right? They're never going to hear the rooster crowing really out loud about it's time to get up. None of that. For them, the people laid under the ground, no more the blazing hearth shall burn. Now, this is interesting. What he's going to start doing is he's going to start wondering, I wonder what kind of life these people live, right? And I'm going to kind of outline all of the things that make them who they are. Obviously, living in a small town, we read this poem in a little bit different way than if we were in the large city. Take a look at what it is no more they will ever have. For them, no more the blazing hearth shall burn, line 21-22. Or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees, the envied kiss to share. It's an interesting word picture. The daddy's worked all day in the fields, and then he comes in, and his little children see him, and they all go running up to him, Daddy, Daddy, and they jump up at him, or they hug him around the knees, and he gets to see his wife working. It's a very domesticated kind of vision of an old school style of living. And all of this, Thomas Gray is going to celebrate in some way. In other words, let's just put it in our notes this way at 2a. Already in a message theme, already we're seeing this. He is saying that these people lived and died, forgotten, and yet hardworking people. Often, line 25, did the harvest to their sickle yield. In other words, they worked as farmers. Their furrow off the stubborn glib has broke. In other words, the ground was so hard as they were trying to till it up. How jocund did they drive their team afield. How bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. Notice the last two lines of the stanza, both with exclamation marks. In other words, he says, these are hard-working people. It's right at level 1. These are hard-working people. Thomas Gray is going to celebrate the hard-working work ethic of these people. Notice the next stanza. Let not ambition, and notice it is capitalized, let not ambition mock their useful toil. In other words, there are people who might look at these farmer, rancher types who are hard worker nobodies and call them useless people, nobodies. What did they accomplish in their life? Ambition. What was their ambition? And of course they would say, what do you mean ambition? I had to get up every morning. I had to work. I had to take care of my children. I came home. I lived my whole life doing this, and then I died. That is it. That's my whole life. And then obviously the question is, yeah, but what did you accomplish? Accomplish? What do you mean accomplish? Notice ambition is capitalized. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. In other words, he says, rich people who live in the city have a tendency to look down on people who live in the country, who usually are not as wealthy, and they're hard-working people, but they have this tendency to kind of look down on them like, you're not as important as we are. You don't do anything really that great. All you do is take care of cows, raise some sheep, maybe plow the ground. Of course, anyone that's around that culture will say, and what do you eat? The food that's grown by these people, so that way you can have something to eat, so you can live, so you can be sustained. In other words, it's this question of which is more important, the people who work in the city or the people who work the land out in the countryside. And Thomas Gray will say, these people who work out in the countryside are every bit as valuable, every bit as important, even though they're kind of nobodies. Notice the next one. The boast of heraldry, that is to say, back to our Chaucer wife of Bath's tale observation here. Nobility, heraldry. In other words, these people were not famous. Let's just write it down that way at level 1. These were not famous people. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth ere gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. And then, of course, a famous line, line 36, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. In other words, no matter how ambitious, rich, powerful you are, sooner or later, death is the great democratizer, the great, we might say, equalizer, right? That is to say, in the end, everybody dies, no matter how famous, no matter how powerful. Nor you. It's interesting, it's almost like Thomas Gray is writing directly to these people who are in the city, who might look down on these country folk, these simple folk. Nor you, ye proud, impute to these the fault if memory o'er their tomb no trophies raise. In other words, they don't have huge kind of mausoleum-like burial places, where through the long-drawn aisle and fretted vault the pealing anthem swells the note of praise. In other words, when rich and powerful people die, they are given these huge and gaudy funerals, and then they're laid in these large kinds of mausoleums. Remember, we can make a 3A observation. Remember at the very end of Romeo and Juliet, the Capulet family is so wealthy. Remember this? That Juliet is thought dead, and she is buried where? Well, under the ground in a mausoleum where there's all of her other family members there. What is going on there? Shakespeare is showing us that the Capulets are worth a lot of money. Notice that Thomas Gray will say here, yeah, these people, they didn't have any of that. None of that. Look at the next one. Can storied urn, your footnote here will say a funeral urn with an epitaph inscribed on it, or animated bust, here again, you know, sometimes people would put a lifelike caricature of themselves. Back to its mansion call the fleeting breath. Can honor's voice provoke the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull, cold ear of death? In other words, he says, it does not matter how powerful you are. It does not matter how beautiful you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. In the end,